Okwira ba ne taripa mechomari ne Rarámuri. I'm coming to you from Chochenyo Ohlone country over here in San Leandro. Although I'm not Ohlone, I am Rarámuri. That's the name of my people and also the language. And so what I plan to do is to introduce some ideas about what I do. In other words, what is ethnobotany? A lot of people, I think, have an idea about what ethnobotany is, but there's a lot more that I think a lot of people don't know about it. And then I want to share some plants and talk about my own background as an ethnobotanist, as an indigenous scholar, and so on. And then I want to make sure we definitely have time for some questions. But so yes, I wrote this book recently, and it's had some good feedback. A lot of people seem to be interested in it, and I've been wondering why. And I think a lot of it is because most people who are getting interested in plants, they want to learn more, of course, about the plants, but the information that's available tends to, especially ethnobotanical sort of writings, tend to focus on, here's the name of the plant, here's what it looks like. If you're lucky, you find information on the native knowledge, the tribes, and their uses of the plants, then it kind of stops there. And I think most of you, have been looking at the chat a little bit and so on. And I think if most of you are interested in plants like myself, you've developed a connection to the plants. And you want to go deeper into it. You want to fully understand why there's this connection. What is this relationship about? And that's where I think this book goes and why people seem to be reacting to it in a very positive way, because my intention was to tell the stories of the plants, to bring them to life, to reveal to them why they are our relatives. And as from an indigenous perspective, that's where I come from as an indigenous scholar and ethnobotanist. And so I'm going to start this share. Hopefully it works. Here we go. And let's make this a little bit bigger. So I'm a professor of American Indian Studies over at California State University, East Bay in Hayward. It's a beautiful campus. If you haven't been there, it sits up on top of a hill overlooking the southern half of the bay. And this is my people, my tribe. Rarámuri is also the name of our language. And there was a student of mine this last semester who was writing a paper, and I asked all the students to do a research project. I asked them to do an ethnobotanical study of a local place, and the local place was very wide open. They can do their grandmother's, garden in their backyard. Some of them even got very creative and did an ethnobotanical study of, a friend's spice pantry. And one of my favorite students did this great study of the various kinds of oaks, in the East Bay and so on. So I really had a lot of fun with that, and the students got a lot out of it too. And one student used some information from a museum, I think it was in Santa Barbara perhaps. And of course I looked at the citation, I sometimes do that double check where the students getting their information. And in the paper, the student used this definition of ethnobotany. Ethnobotany is a study of human uses of plants. You notice I put a question mark at the end of that, because to me, as a practicing ethnobotanist, I think this is misleading and incomplete. There's a lot more to ethnobotany than just how people use plants. You know, way back at the close of the 19th century and going into the early 20th century, scholars, mostly from the East, there were some British scholars as well, and a couple of French scholars, were concerned about the quick disappearance of native knowledge of North American communities, especially those out west. And so scholars began to move out towards the west, beginning in Missouri, hitting some of the reservations in the Dakotas, kept on going out to the West Coast, trying to make sure that they could capture as much of this information about native knowledge as possible. And a lot of it, of course, focused on language and plant knowledge and ecological knowledge. And this new discipline emerged from the known as ethnoscience, the study of the different ways the world is perceived and categorized by different cultures. And from that new discipline emerged, of course, a subdiscipline of ethnobotany and ethnoecology. And there are different definitions running around for a few decades until one of my mentors, Richard I. Ford, in 1978, he pretty much coined the definition that we still rely on today as ethnobotanists and ethnoecologists, a study of the direct interrelationships between people and plants. And of course, if we're looking at ethnoecology, take it a little bit further, the direct interrelationships between people and their local landscapes and ecosystems. And the key concept here is direct. Now, when I present this to my students, you know, I want to always give them an example, so I'll do the same thing here with you. Think about all the interactions you have with plants, including food plants in this case, and how much of a deep understanding do you have with these plants. For example, there's a food, guacamole. And I'll bring that up to my students in class and I ask them, okay, how many of you know what the main plant is that we get guacamole from? And of course, most of them recognize that it's avocados. But then I'll ask them, well, how do avocados grow? And then there are fewer of them know that avocados grow in trees. And then I just keep going further and further to the point where I ask, there might be one or two students who finally know that there's a certain time of year you gather avocados and they only grow in certain parts of California and Mexico and so on. So that's what I'm talking about with this deep interrelationship between people and plants. We might know the names of plants, but do we know everything about the plants? Do we know their entire life cycle? And do we know how they affect our lives? And see, that's where ethnobotany wants to go, those direct relationships. And speaking of relationships, another example, a living example today would be something like manu min, which is the staple food of the Anishinaabe people from up in the Great Lakes region. In other words, people who otherwise are known as Ojibwe and or Chippewa as well, living up in the northern regions of Minnesota and Wisconsin and along that Canadian border region there. And they have this incredible relationship with wild rice, which is their word, manumin. And every year, this time of year actually, they move through the rice paddies. These aren't paddies that they planted themselves. These are wild rice paddies that are growing along the edges of ponds and lakes and slower moving streams. and they'll paddle their boats and canoes through the rice fields while someone sitting in a boat is literally taking these sticks and hitting the tops of the plants and collecting the grains into the boat. Later on, there's a whole process where they process the rice, they roast it and so on. And it's just an incredible food. If you've ever not had wild rice from up in the Great Lakes region, I'm not talking about the wild rice you get at Trader Joe's or that grows here up by Sacramento and Marysville in California. I'm talking about true wild rice from the Great Lakes region. You eat this food and you feels like your body is being healed from the inside out. That's how wonderful a food it is. But the relationship for the Anishinaabe goes much deeper. They owe in a way, their emergence onto their land to this grain, to this food. They were led to where they are now from further east, following a prophecy where they would come to a place where their main food would grow from the waters. And it's a long story, but that's how they ended up where they are now, due to a scout who was a hunter and who was following a duck, which introduced that scout, that hunter, to wild rice. And the Anishinaabe owe their whole existence to this one food. So that's example now, a deeper example of what I'm talking about with relationships. And this is where I want to keep going. This is where the focus of my work is, and where I hope that the book is focused on as well. For Native peoples, we foster this deep relationship with everything around us, including plants. We are the caretakers, and we celebrate these relationships. This is mostly what our ceremonies and our rituals are about. It's a celebration of our connection to everything around us. And this is what the wild rice looks like when it's collected from the wild plants. And this is one of the plants growing. It looks like a tall grass, and that's really what it is. It is in the grass family, but it's the grain that's collected from August to September. Another example what I'm talking about is more local here. You go out into the foothill, you start going north, and you hopefully, if you know what you're looking for, you sooner or later come across a pacanum, and in other words, known as Indian hemp. And it's an incredible plant. It's a kind of milkweed, or a type of milkweed, but for Native peoples here in Northern California, going all the way up into British Columbia, this plant means much more than just it being a milkweed, and how you can do actually some medicinal value to it. This plant played a role in creating the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, and it was an indirect role, and it was due to a trickster, or what some people think of Coyote. It was one of the main trickster figures. And it was Coyote, long story short, who was trying to protect his friends, to save his friends from this huge monster that was sucking everything around into its huge belly. And Coyote challenged the monster to a sucking contest. And he did some preparation, of course, ahead of time. And one of the things he made sure he did was that he collected a bunch of the Indian hemp. And later in the year, around September or so, you can collect these plants. And I have some in my yard out here. And I do this when I teach my classes in the fall. And you take the stems and you can dry them out, and then you can lightly pound them, and it separates these strong fibers. If you know what you're doing, you can twist those fibers into a string. You just keep adding more fibers and twisting, and you get more string. And then Eventually you can start to braid the string. And then you can take those braids and twist them into a rope. Native peoples here in Northern California and up into the further into the Pacific Northwest would literally make miles and miles of these cords, these strings, and then weave them again into hundreds of yards of fishing nets. And of course, in the Pacific Northwest, 7 kinds of different salmon throughout the year make their way up into the various rivers. And using these nets made out of Indian hemp, they collect their staple food in the Pacific Northwest, different kinds of salmon. But going back to Coyote, he made his rope out of Indian hemp, and he purposely made that challenge to the monster, knowing that he was going to end up being sucked into the belly of the monster. And that's exactly what happened. And there he found his friends. There was bear and rattlesnake and muskrat and blue jay and so on, who had all been sucked into the monster. And one thing led to another, and he used that rope to tie around the heart of the monster. And he had lit a fire inside the monster, and it caused the heart of the monster to stop beating so much. And beforehand, Coyote told his buddies, when the monster starts to die, make sure you're ready to leave from all the different orifices of the monster. And so that's exactly what happened. The monster died. Coyote took his flint knife, chopped the monster into different parts, and then started to throw them into different directions. And that's where Mount Hood was created. That's where the Cascade Mountains came from. That's where Mount St. Helena came from. Coyote used the parts of the monster to create that landscape in the Pacific Northwest. And so again, it's more than just knowing the name of the plant and how to use it. It's about, what does this plant mean to my identity as an Indigenous person? How is my relationship, my own self as a Native person, as a person connected to this landscape, connected also to this plant? And so again, that's what I'm talking about with ethnobotany and the study of these relationships. So for me personally, I was raised traditionally. My first language is not English, it's Rarámuri, and also Mayo, because I'm half Mayo, which is my father's native tribe, and then half Rarámuri, which is my mother's side of the family. Because we're matrilineal, I identify more as Rarámuri. Everything, the lineages and their clans are passed down through the mother's side of the family. But nevertheless, I was raised by a family who all were living libraries of the millennia of this kind of knowledge that I'm talking about, this plant knowledge, this ecological knowledge. And that's how, I got into knowing about plants and having them play a role in a lot of ways, my own career. Going through school, through university, through college and university, I always took a chance. Whenever there was an opportunity to write a research paper, I focused on native knowledge, and especially plant knowledge, whenever I got that opportunity. And it wasn't until later on, and when I was finishing my master's degree, and I wanted to go get a PhD, and I was in Colorado at the university there, and my main advisor informed me, well, you're an ethnobotanist. And she said this after reading different papers I'd written about plant knowledge and native peoples. And that was the first that I had heard that concept, that idea, that one could follow that as a career, ethnobotany. And that's what I ended up doing at Arizona State University. And it's taken me to where I am now, teaching American Indian Studies courses at California State University, East Bay. And one of the things that I remind people whenever I get the opportunity, when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, and especially plant knowledge, and by the way, this picture here is from my people as well. But when we're talking about native plant knowledge, I like to remind people that we were never one single homogeneous culture. I know that's redundant. We were never a homogeneous culture. There were over 500 languages spoken in just North America before Europeans showed up. If you go south into Mexico and then down into South America, we're talking about a couple of thousand different languages being spoken when Europeans first showed up. And each one of those languages represents a different, unique culture. And each of these cultures develop a unique lifestyle. And as a result, a library of ecological knowledge that's unique to those ecosystems, those landscapes that they sustainably manage for the most part, for thousands of years. And so, in other words, all native knowledge is local. So it would be really tough, as I point out here, to be a traditional Ohlone in New Mexico. The land is so different. The plants are so different. Everything is very different. The whole climate is different. And so plant knowledge is very unique to the people and from those landscapes. And this same knowledge now that I'm talking about is shared and reproduced and learned mostly through oral literature and mostly through story. And I'm not talking about the kind of story where you once upon a time, then there's a story, and then they all lived happily ever after sort of thing. I'm talking about how our whole lives are a story. When we wake up every day, we're just participating in this ongoing story. And so for myself, my mother, my grandparents, or my other relatives never sat me down and just said, all right, Enrique, we're going to learn today about echinacea or something like that. It was always something like maybe I might be in the cornfield helping my grandmother and my grandfather, get rid of weeds or doing some planting or who knows what, doing some watering, and it would get hot. And we would go sit under this big, huge fig tree at the edge of the field that my grandfather had there with his other fruit trees. And he would just suddenly start telling me, hey, did I ever tell you about tobacco and water gourd? And then he would break into a little narrative about tobacco and water gourd and how they were friends, they gambled too much and so on. And just over time, just by listening and by doing, by helping my grandmother with her herbs, and she was grinding herbs and twisting them into grades of different that and watching her use them for helping our relatives who had gotten sick. In other words, on-the-job training is where we learn this kind of information. And this reproduction of plant knowledge that I'm talking about is transferred and learned through, as I mentioned, story. It's in ceremony. You listen to the songs of the ceremony, listen to the chanters, and there's plant knowledge and ecological knowledge encoded in the ceremony as well. Sometimes it's a result of being initiated into certain kinds of knowledge. I didn't mention I am Parrot Clan from my mother's side. And there was an initiation involved once I reached a certain age of being a full-fledged member of the clan. And as a result, there are certain kinds of responsibilities that come with that. And then there's knowledge associated with those responsibilities. Some of that is plant knowledge. And so that's what I mean by initiation. Some plant knowledge is gendered. There are some things that I, as a male, don't know, but people, a woman from my family or from my tribe also know about plants. There's sometimes an example where out in New Mexico with people, the Pueblo peoples along the Rio Grande and the Rio Chama in northern New Mexico, the men know where to collect the plants, but they don't know a whole lot about what to do with them. But they'll bring them back home, and the women know how to use the plants for food and for medicine and spices and so on. So that's another kind of gendered knowledge. And then, of course, just doing, just being with the plants, learning, as I mentioned earlier, this on-the-job training, sort of experiential learning, learning how to weave a basket like this, or how to grow, different kinds of corn, or even what kind of spices and so on, what ingredients go into making one of my favorite dishes this time of year, calabacitas, which you see here in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide here. As a Native person and as a Native scholar, it's been one of my jobs, I guess you would call it that, has been to try to translate, in a way, what I know as a Native person in a way that non-Native people understand. Okay. And I use this ethnoscientific theory that I mentioned earlier to do that. And it's mostly through language. And this is one of the difficulties of this, is that we're dealing with two very different philosophical approaches to plant knowledge. Think about, if we take even a conservative view, Native peoples here in North America have been interacting with, observing, and using the plants of our local ecosystems for at least 20,000 years. Personally, I think we've been here much longer, at least 40,000 years. There's some scholars who will take it, of course, longer, 60, 70,000 years. Then if you talk to traditional peoples, and they'll tell you, well, we've always been here on this land. We emerged to these landscapes. Now compare that then to how long have Western ecologists and botanists been studying the plants and landscapes of North America? It's only been maybe 200 years or so. And so that's a very different scope of understanding plants, 200 years compared to thousands of years. And we realize then that as Native peoples, then we really have this very sophisticated and complex understanding of plants and ecological knowledge, but it's just a very different philosophical approach. Where, for example, my people, we classify plants by gender and ethnicity, which, it's going to take me a lot longer to explain that. I just wanted to show you this, there's very different approaches to understanding. It's a different kind of science, in other words, okay? And encoded in those thousands of years of indigenous ways of talking about and managing our local landscapes is actually a lot of information that can play a role in helping us mitigate things like climate changes, global warming, and how it's already impacting our foods. And you have a speaker from what I see, we're going to be, next time you guys do this, is going to be going deeper into that. And so I hope he brings up the importance of Native knowledge can play a role in helping us to mitigate these climate changes, especially around our food. We've been dealing with changes in climate for thousands of years, and we've, over time, developed and hybridized different kinds of food plants, especially to be able to better produce food, and sometimes in very extreme conditions. And so contemporary ethnoscientists, ethnoecologists, and ethnobotanists can play an important role in uncovering some of this important knowledge. And then finally, before I get to talking about some of my favorite plants, although I already see I'm gonna have to cut some of that short already, I just wanted to point out that originally it was not my idea to write this book. So if you have a copy of this or you're planning to get a copy of this, it was actually not my idea to write this book. I was contacted by the folks over at Timber Press, which if you're not familiar with Timber Press, they put out some great plant books. And they asked me to write a book about native plant knowledge. And they had done something like this before by Daniel Mowerman, but if you ever come across that book, it's really just pretty much example what I mentioned earlier. It's like a dictionary of plants. And here's the name of the plant, here's the tribes that used it and how they used it and so on. And it doesn't really bring the plants to life. And that's what Timber Press hoped that I would do. And so what I did is I reached out to my ethnobotanical friends and native relatives and contemporaries and ethnobotanical network. And I asked people, send me a list of the 10 most important plants to your tribe, to your community, maybe to your region where you live. And I got back a lot of lists from different friends and so on. And it's from that list that I put together the 80 plants that are in this book. And I wanted to focus on just a small grouping, like just the 80 plants, so that I can really bring out the story, the life, the soul of these different plants. And so that's what I was hoping to do with this book, and hopefully you will enjoy it. But I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and I will make sure we have time for some questions, but I want to do one more thing here and just bring up a few of my favorite plants and just tell you a little bit more about them. For example, the state plant of California, and one of the most difficult Latin names to pronounce. I have a hard time pronouncing Eschlosia californica. But a lot of folks don't realize that besides being an incredible plant that pops up in the springtime and in our front yards and so on, those of us who are lucky to have it growing in our neighborhoods, when the plant is young, the greens are edible. But of course, it's a really good medicinal plant, particularly the root. It acts as a mild laxative. It's often made into a decoction or an infusion and watered down and given to people who are having a hard time sleeping, especially children. It has some antibiotic properties as well, the root, again, because of the presence of some alkaloids. And just to remind you that, these plants are going to mention, if you're not that familiar with them, then, don't just go out and try to collect them and see how it works for you, because they do have some powerful phytochemicals. So make sure you work with someone who's really knowledgeable about some of these plants. But before, I move on to another one, also, this plant is very important to a lot of California natives. For example, the Chumash believe that when we pass, when we die, we go into this in-between space. And in that space, Raven will come and remove our eyes. But then our eyes are quickly replaced by the flowers of California poppies. And when we're in that situation, in that part of our afterlife, we're able to see better as a result of this replacement of our eyes with the flowers of California poppies. Later on, as we move through this in-between space, the poppies are replaced by abalone. And so, again, this, the plant is more than just having some medicinal uses and even edible greens. It means much more to people in California, native people, in regards to the afterlife. Another one of my favorite plants, the California Laurel. And hopefully, I imagine you're familiar with this plant. The leaves can be used like bay laurel you might get at the grocery store in the spice section, but they're much more powerful because of the volatile oils that are present in these leaves. You just stand under these trees and you can smell those volatile oils. And it's those same volatile oils that can be used, that play a role in helping us to relieve migraines. You can make a poultice out of the leaves. Now, some people have a strong reaction to the leaves, to the volatile oils. They might get headaches from just smelling it. And because those oils are so strong, if you do try to use it in food, you only want to use maybe a quarter of one of the leaves because it's so powerful. At the same time, however, you can eat these olive-sized berries or nuts. You can eat the pulp. You can take that inner part, and there's a nut-like pith in there. But I recommend that you roast it. Some people try to eat it straight, and it's kind of bitter. But if you roast it, a lot of the bitterness leaves, and just like anything else you roast, the deeper flavors will come out of that nut, and that's something you look for, in the springtime as well. Anyway, and here's an example of the kind of string or rope you can make from the Indian hemp, and you can see right here how you can take those strings that are twisted and then do the braiding. You can take those braids and make it into a thicker rope as well. So one of my favorite plants there. And then if you ever go hang out in Muir Woods, for example, or any place where there's not a whole lot of sun, but the soil is damp, you're probably going to come across the Horsetail Equisetum. There's different kinds of Equisetum species in California here. And I like this plant because it reminds me of another coyote story. And the example of how ecological knowledge can be embedded in stories. So Coyote was going around one day near this river. It was late spring and the river was up. It was raging because of the snow melt. It was cold. The water was very cold. And Coyote is hanging around this river, being Coyote, looking for something to get involved in. And he slips and he falls into this river. And he's being rushed down this river and he's practically drowning. And he's thinking, oh my, I gotta do something. I have to get out of this river before I drown. And he starts to look, he makes his way to the bank and he's trying to grab grasses and roots, but nothing's holding him back or holding him to the edge there. So he's still going down the river. He looks ahead and he sees this plant that's, this kind of ugly looking plant. It's kind of deep, dark green and so on, right next to the bank. And he's thinking, oh, I'll go ahead and give it one shot. And he grabs the plant and it stops him from falling more down the river, but he's still in the water and he's barely hanging on. And so he talks to the plant and tells the plant, please help me get out of this river. If you do that, I will make you into a beautiful plant. I'll change the way you look and I'll make you a very important plant. And of course, he's talking to Horsetail. And Horsetail is thinking, I don't know. You're a coyote. You never keep your promises. You always cause problems wherever you are. But Coyote is very desperate. He says, no, I'll definitely keep my promise this time. Don't worry, I'm not trying to trick you. And so Horsetail thinks, all right, I'll do it. And he digs his roots deeper into the edge of the river. And because of that, Coyote's able to pull himself out of the water. And he gets up on the bank and he keeps his promise. And he transforms this ugly looking plant into this incredible plant, horsetail, that we know today. And if you ever look closely at horsetail, you can see it has this amazing purplish, dark purple colors at the bottom of each one of the segments. And then, different times of the year, these amazing whorls will grow out of the segment there. And it's a very useful plant. You can use it for, you can make a tea out of it. It's really good for internal infections, like urinary tract infections and sore throats. You can gargle with it. And a lot of people don't realize that the main stems are comprised of a lot of silicas. And you can actually use the stems for like a sandpaper, like a polishing cloth. If you can look behind me, I don't know how big your screens are, you can see this cello behind me, and there's another instrument over my other shoulder there hanging on the edge of the bookshelf. I'm a luthier. I make stringed instruments. And I do have a bunch of horsetail growing out in the north wall of my backyard over here. And one of the things I'll do when I do the final polishing of the wood is I'll take this horsetail and I'll polish the wood. It's like using like a 200, 300 grit sandpaper. And so another use of horsetail. This time of year, if you're walking along some of the drier trails in the foothills in Marin or in the East Bay or other place where there's sun hitting the disturbed trails, keep your eye out to the side of the trail and look for this tall flower. It's about 2 foot tall or something like that. It'll have a single stem going down by itself, and there'll be this narrow basal leaf growth at the ground level. Make sure you have a nice little shovel or something, and you can dig down about 6 inches or so, and you'll come into Nahavita tubers, which are a wild kind of potato. And take them home, brush them off, get all the dirt off, rinse them, roast them, and those are good eating. If you're into wild foraging, this is something you want to give a try. There used to be a lot more of the Nahavita. There used to be some hillsides where they were practically bluish purple because there were so many of the plants growing. And native peoples relied on this as a seasonal food source, a staple food here in California. Because of climate changes and other disturbances, the disruption of our landscapes, and also our pollinators, not seeing so many of these plants, but they're still out there if you know what to look for. And then I think I might end with this because I want to make sure that there's time for questions. I see in the chat and in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions. When I just want to give you an example of how plants play a role in our identities, our sense of self, and our own histories, our memories. So of course, this is stinging nettle. It's a great plant. It's another plant that can be used for its fibers. You can take the leaves and they become an edible green. You boil it and those little stingers will actually come off. The formic acid, which is what actually gives you the stinging sensation, will dissipate if you boil it and mix it with your other edible greens and so on. You can actually take the roots, and it's very good for headaches and it's full of flavonoids and coumarins, which are really good for as an analgesic. So it's a very useful plant. And whenever I think of this plant, however, I always think of Roosevelt elks. I was backpacking up in the Lost Coast Wilderness. And if you ever backpacked up there, you know that the the trail goes along the coast and it dips down into these little ravines sometimes, and there's a little stream, and the streams aren't big. You can usually pretty much hop across them, or sometimes just take a few steps on some rocks. And I was doing that very thing, and my hiking buddy told me to stop. I was halfway across a little stream, and there's all this deep foliage. You can hardly see, a few feet ahead of you, and he told me to stop. And he said, "Look up." And I looked up, and about 3 feet away from me was the nuzzle, this nose, this big, huge nose of a Roosevelt elk. And that's all I could see. And in its mouth was stinging nettles. And then I got a little closer. It was only like 3 feet away, but I kind of bend over, and there was the rest of the elk. And these things are huge. You don't really realize how huge elks are until you're right next to them. So ever since, but whenever I think of stinging nettle, I think of Roosevelt elks as well. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully you have some good questions or some comments or so on, and let's see where we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salmón. There are quite a few. The Q&A is building. I sure hope you have some time to share with us some more.
Yeah, let's see how much we can get through before my voice gives out.
Thank you. Would you like for us to relay them, or would you like to read them yourself?
Why don't you go ahead and pick out some for me to answer, and we'll see where we go.
Are there examples? This is from Mariella. Are there examples of indigenous peoples who built new relationships with the landscapes that they were forced to migrate to?
One of my favorite examples of that is, one of the first examples I gave you was earlier in my talk with Anishinaabe, because they were originally from upper state New York, closely related to the Oneida up in upper state New York. They're both Algonquian speakers. And they were, like in the story, when the scout followed the duck and introduced them to wild rice, they were in the process of migrating west from upper state New York. And they were migrating further and further west until they finally came across the wild rice beds, and then stopped there in upper Wisconsin and Minnesota. And so that's a great example right there of how they, even though they're indigenous people, they had to further become indigenous to that landscape as well, because there's some similarities between the Great Lakes region, upper state New York, but there's still a lot of differences as well. So that's one example. The Apache, Navajo are Athabascan speakers who originally are from way up further north in what today would be northern Alberta, Saskatchewan. But again, they were forcibly removed by other native peoples further and further south until they ended up in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. And so again, they over time became more and more indigenous to that landscape as well. So yeah, there's plenty of examples of that sort of thing. And it's still happening today as native peoples are being forcibly removed from Central America and coming up to the border regions here in the United States, Mexico area.
Thank you. Leslie Lee asked, what are some recommendations you have about how non-Indigenous folks can learn to address the effects of climate change?
That's a good question. What do you think? Well, let's see. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I think maybe she's asking, as you had mentioned, it's comforting to us to know that there are people that have been learning these plants for tens of thousands of years. And since most of our, and as climate change seems to be coming on more sudden than we ever imagined, and we're wondering if there's, you know, some corollary, some connection, that some stories that these people can share about these plants that might be able to help out modern day folks trying, you know, or folks just are trying to understand how climate change is going to affect our biodiversity.
I think that's similar to other questions I've gotten where people want to get an idea of how they, in a way, can kind of become indigenous to their landscape, to the places they live now, and to develop more of a deeper connection and relationship to their local landscapes, and in our case, the plants here. And my answer to that, because this is going to address the larger answer about climate change as well, is something that I ask my students to do. Every semester when I teach my Eating the Landscape class, and then when I teach my Ethnobotany class, Eating the Landscape class is an agroecology class. And I ask my students to participate in a semester-long, once a week exercise where I ask them to watch either a sunset or a sunrise, and to do this from the same exact place, looking in the same direction at the same time of day. And at first, the students aren't sure what they're being asked to do, because I asked them to write these weekly journals. And so I read what they're experiencing. I asked them to do this for at least 15 or 20 minutes. And then by around the third or fourth week, I realized as I'm reading their journals, their awareness of everything around them is expanding. And it's not just the awareness of that, you know, they're slowing down and they're paying more attention of things happening. They're realizing that the sun does actually move throughout the year and so on. They become more aware of things like one student watching a deer chewing on a plant. And then the student decided to find out what that plant was. And then he went deeper as the semester went on, learning more about the ecology of the plant, the relationship of the deer to the plant, the insects, and so on. And so my point here is that all of us need to take more time to just stop and practice this awareness. And it's like, it's not just stopping and not doing anything, but it's engaging in a kind of mindful awareness, or other people will call it mindfulness. And I'm not preaching Buddhism or anything like that, but just stopping and recognizing and being aware of everything around us. And if we can start to do that with plants, even sometimes just one plant, start by maybe deciding to grow a jalapeno plant. And then next year, grow some more jalapenos. Maybe grow some more things that you're going to mix with the jalapenos. And over time, you start to become aware of the needs of the plants. And you can do this just with wild plants as well. You can do this with just your landscape in your garden. And understanding your connection to it, understanding your practices, your choices you make on these plants. And I think if more of us can do this, then we can start to understand how we have a direct impact on what's happening to the plants as a result of climate change, because we're the ones doing it. We need to, as Indigenous people, or all of us, become more like Indigenous people and paying more attention to how our choices impact everything around us and then the generations beyond us. And so that's my long answer to not an easy question, but a very important question.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit about your garden?
Well, I grow a lot of plants that are from my people. I have a couple of varieties of corn. I grow flour corn, so it's not a sweet corn. It's grown intentionally to let dry on the stalk, and then I'll grind it into, um, uh, I have a mix of red and blue flour because I like to make blue corn pancakes and tortillas and so on. But then I also have my sweet corn. I definitely have a couple of different salsa gardens. I grow a lot of edible greens because I like to eat, like the saute greens and stuff like that. And if you looked at my garden, you would, I'm looking out the window at my garden, by the way. If you looked at my garden, it would not look that well kept up because what happens is that I actually I permit a lot of useful weeds, so what people would call weeds. One of my friends once told me a weed is just a useful plant with a lousy press agent. And so I allow what other people would call weeds to grow among my garden because they do a couple of things. They actually return nutrients to the soil. They provide shade and a kind of mulch, and they're useful. You can use them for medicine and for edible greens and that sort of thing. And so, if you, my garden would not end up on the cover of Home and Garden or Sunset or something like that, but it does what I need it to do as well. I also have a lot of medicinal plants out there. I try not to use modern medicine if I can help it.
Very nice. So how can we learn more from you? Are your classes open to the general public, and do you do online classes?
Yeah, all of our classes are online, and people who even aren't enrolled Cal State East Bay students can do something. I can't remember what the word they use, but there's a way for people to enroll in an online classes without having to be fully, full-time student. I can't remember what the word, but if you look at the Cal State East Bay website, the registrar's website as well, and search around a little bit, you can find it. And then, for example, this fall, I'm teaching that Eating the Landscape class, which is the agroecology class. And then I'm teaching another class, which is American Indian worldview, which American Indian spirituality class. It's called God is Red. And so that's kind of an interesting class if you're interested in further understanding of Native people's spirituality.
Thank you very much. Are you up for taking more? I don't want to wear out our welcome here.
Let's do about 3 or 4 more. Let's see where it goes.
Okay. What criteria did then Indigenous peoples use to name plants? Was it often from just significant events that happened, do you think?
A lot of it is through a result of observing the nature of the plants, because remember, for Native peoples, these plants are our relatives. We are directly related to them. We looked at them as direct relatives, just like our human aunts and uncles and cousins and so on. And so we approach them as such. And one of my favorite examples for a name of a plant is a Seri name for this. It's an edible green that grows along the coast of the Sea of Cortez, way down by Punta Chueca, Desemboque, Quino Bay. If you go down into Sonora, Mexico, and go to Hermosillo, then hang a right and go to the bay, the Quino Bay, which is right there on the coast of the Sea of Cortez. There's these edible plants that grow right there near the water. They're kind of salty. The sea turtles like to eat them, and they eat them because it makes them vomit. It's a way of cleansing themselves. And the name of the plant in the Seri word, the Seri language, is what sea turtle throws up. And so this is one example of how Native peoples will name a plant. My people, we have a plant that is closely related to peyote. It's an Echinocerius. It's a kind of succulent or cactus, but it's a little wilder. And it's called Ecolisimaro, and that essentially means crazy peyote. But the way we classify it is, it's, as I mentioned before, we classify plants by gender and ethnicity. And so this particular cactus is a male, but it's a male Apache, because it's peyote, you can count on how you react to peyote, but this particular cactus, you can't always count on how it's going to affect you. And so that's why it's a male Apache. And that goes back to our long kind of turbulent history with Apaches in Northwest Mexico. So this is a couple of examples of how Native peoples name plants.
Fun. So Jess, who lives in LA, is of Mayan descent. Was curious who you were Tongva Chumash teachers.
Say that again?
Who were your Tongva Chumash teachers?
Well, I'm not Tongva or Chumash, I'm Rarámuri.
Right.
And so I don't know how to answer that. I know a Tongva person, a friend of mine, L. Frank Manriquez, who is a Tongva artist. But yeah, I really can't answer that question.
Well, thank you. You've been very generous with your time, and we're so grateful to have you here with us today. And we'll leave it at that, and hope to meet you in person someday soon. You're right over in the Hayward area, right? In San Lorenzo, is it?
San Leandro.
San Leandro, right? Very well. Hopefully we'll all get to meet in person someday. We really appreciate your time.
Adios.
Thanks, everyone.